Good morning, everyone, and welcome. If you're tuning in for the first time today, my name is Gene, and I serve here at C3 Church as your lead pastor. I want to thank you for inviting me into your living room. Is that a jelly donut? Can I have a bite? No, that's not the way it works. We're not there technologically just yet. Well, now that I've just made your kids smear a jelly donut all over your screen, I'll give you some time to clean it up. And while you're doing that, I want to thank the Bible Project. That's where we got that really awesome video that you saw just before I arrived on screen today. I'm always referring them. They're a great resource. Go ahead and check them out. That's the Bible Project. Great stuff over there. We are continuing in our series on the book of Romans. Romans is indeed one of the greatest theological works ever written. And this is why, rightly, it's a favorite of many Christians. We've entitled our series, When in Rome. You see, there's the background picture here that I was giving you last week. That is that Paul is writing to a church in Rome that he's never been to. He's never been to Rome, unlike Corinth. We saw that in the Corinthians series that we just finished up. So Paul's writing them. He makes mention of it in chapters 15 and in chapters 1. There's the big question. Did he ever get to Rome? Did he ever make it all the way there on this occasion that he was talking about in chapter 15 on his way to Spain? He's going to stop by and hang out with them for a little bit. We know from the book of Acts that Paul did indeed arrive in Rome, but the occasion was a little bit different. Paul was on trial, and he gets sent there because he appeals to Caesar as a Roman citizen. But the question is, did he arrive there again on his way to Spain? We got some hints from the book of Clement, First Clement that is, but it's hard to tell for sure. We saw a possible thesis statement in Romans chapter 1, and it's important, so I want to read it to you again. Romans 1, starting at verse 16, Paul writes, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is God's own power for salvation to all who have faith in God, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. God's righteousness is being revealed in the gospel from faithfulness for faith. As it is written, the righteous person will live by faith." Now, there's also an occasion for writing. I explained this to you last week, so I'll be brief on this point. You can go back and check out that message. The Jewish people had been expelled, that is, sent out of Rome by the Emperor Claudius in around 49 AD. Well, it doesn't last very long and they come back, but here's the thing. There are also Gentile believers, that is, non-Jewish believers, who build churches. They continue building up the church in Rome, but they're not under the law of Moses. So the Jewish people come back to a very Gentile church. They don't like it. They're not observing these Jewish traditions. I have described to you that it was like a Jewish sect at first, like a Jewish denomination, this Christianity that we're talking about and living in today. They come back to a church that's different. And so we see kind of like a cultural clash going on and arguments about what we should be doing and what we shouldn't doing. So Paul writes to kind of clean up this disunity that we're seeing in the church. And then along the way, we get some great theology here. Now, Romans chapter 1 sets us up for the theme between chapters 1 and chapters 5. I talked about this in the past, especially in the Corinthians series. We see themes that go over a larger number of chapters. 1 through 5, it's all about God's righteousness and our state of sin. The thesis statement for this group can be found in Romans 3:23. We've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Paul sets us up for that in the first chapter, God's righteousness and our state of sin. He's going to continue, but again, recapping some of last week, I want to continue to give you encouragement. I did that last week. I talked about opportunities lost, that we shouldn't focus so much on those lost opportunities that we lose sight of all the new opportunities that God was faithful to provide. So I'm really happy to let you know that I've been seeing these new opportunities all over the place, and I want to share it with you before we begin in chapters 2. I've been seeing people sharing the messages more often, engaging with it, and people are actually joining C3 Church from afar. They're saying they can't wait until we can meet again. And I can't wait to meet a whole bunch of new friends. We also have people engaging in our Bible studies from afar. It's amazing. There are people joining us from out of state that maybe perhaps never would have before. So again, be on the lookout for these new opportunities that are arising through this whole thing. They might not have happened if this didn't happen. Romans chapter 2. In chapter 2, Paul will speak about a specific thing and a specific sin, as we'll see. Again, there are these divisions between the Jews and the Gentiles. The Jews maybe feel superior in their customs and their traditions. They have the law, and they're proud of it. The Gentiles don't. But just because they have the law doesn't make them any better. And are they really following the law? So this is what Paul's addressing here in chapter 2. Let's take a look at it here. Romans 2, starting at verse 17. He writes this, "But if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law, if you brag about your relationship to God, if you know the will of God, if you are taught by the law, so that you can figure out the things that really matter, if you have persuaded yourself that you are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an educator of the foolish, a teacher of infants, since you have the full content of knowledge and truth in the law, then why don't you, who are teaching others, teach yourself? If you preach, no stealing, do you steal? If you say, no adultery, do you commit adultery? If you hate idols, do you rob temples?" Now, he's pointing out the sin of hypocrisy. You see, in a forest, there are lots of different kinds of trees. There are really big trees and really small trees. And some have noted that loggers don't always cut down the really big trees. And it's brought a question to mind, and many who've observed this. Why not? A big, huge tree must yield way more lumber. But the loggers know something, that sometimes these really big trees are actually hollow on the inside. On the outside, they're the picture of strength, size, majesty, but on the inside, there's nothing there. They're rotten. This is what hypocrisy's like. Presenting yourself a certain way on the outside, but on the inside being something completely different. This is what we're going to look at today. It's about keeping up appearances. Paul continues in Romans chapter 2, starting at verse 28. "It isn't the Jew who maintains outward appearances who will receive praise from God, and it isn't people who are outwardly circumcised on their bodies Again, outward appearances. Instead, it is the person who is a Jew inside, who is circumcised in spirit, not literally. That person's praise doesn't come from people, but from God. Jesus has pretty strong feelings about hypocrites, and he doesn't hold back. Why? Well, most of the time, Jesus is talking about teachers. These are people who should know better. We know in the Bible that teachers will get judged more strictly. It's because we have fuller knowledge. We should know better. But we shouldn't put up false piety or false pretenses. We should be honest about who we are on the inside. Well, there's a group of people that Jesus singles out. They're called the Pharisees. You see, there are basically two religious denominations of the Jews, so to speak, that we'll talk about and that the Bible points out. These are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. There are other groups, the scribes or the teachers of the law and the Herodians, but they fall under the category of the Pharisees for the most part. You see, the Sadducees, they don't believe in that resurrection from the dead that we talked about on Easter. The Pharisees do. They have more similar beliefs to what Jesus believed. They didn't, for the most part, believe in Jesus, that he would rise from the dead, but they believed in a resurrection from the dead at the end time. So Jesus addresses these Pharisees as hypocrites. He does so a lot in Matthew chapter 23. So I want to take us there and point something out. He says, how terrible it will be for your legal experts, that's scribes and Pharisees. Hypocrites, you clean the outside of the cup and plate, but inside they're full of violence and pleasure-seeking. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup so that the outside of the cup will be clean too. Consistency. Just like the big trees, they're nice on the outside, but rotten on the inside. Jesus says this in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 6, starting at verse 5. When you pray, don't be like the hypocrites. They love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners so that people will see them. I assure you, that's the only reward they'll get. But when you pray, go to your room, shut the door, and pray to your Father who is present in that secret place. Your Father who sees what you do in secret will reward you. See, the Pharisees are displaying this false piety in their prayers and everything that they do. Look how holy I am. Look how great I am. Do we do this with our claims of faith today? I wonder, in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic, are there people doing that with their faith? Do some Christian leaders do that? Do leaders today say, look how fearless I am. I'm not afraid. I have very strong faith. I'm fearless. But inside, really, they're afraid, just like you. Some religious leaders today are doing the same thing. But this creates false bravery, which leads to fake faith. When we do this, we not only become hypocrites, we also try to do it on our own instead of giving it to God in prayer, like Jesus did, as we'll see today. We try to comfort ourselves with something fake. We have to balance bravery, true bravery, with honesty. Some have called me brutally honest. Maybe they're right. I don't know. Maybe it's partially true. But I think good leaders are usually brutally honest with people, with their words. In their actions, they display bravery on the outside. It would be better to be honest, completely honest about our fears, what we're going through. But when it's our time to get up to the plate, we knock it out of the park. Rather than have this false sense of security. Nah, I got it. I'm not afraid of anything. I'm going to knock it out of the park. And then when it's our turn at bat, we strike out. Which one do you think is better? We are to walk in humility and shouldn't boast. And this includes about our faith, especially if our faith is lacking. We'll see that Jesus was honest about his anxiety, yet brave in his obedience to the cross. Jesus' brutal honesty. He warns about the cross in Mark chapters 8 through 10. He warns about his suffering, what he's going to go through once in each chapter. The first time, he says he's going to suffer many things. That is the Son of Man. He's going to be handed over to the leaders. They're going to mistreat him. He's going to suffer many things. Ultimately, he's going to die. But then he's going to rise from the dead. This is hard for the disciples to hear. So Peter, the lead disciple, so to speak, he pulls Jesus aside and tries to rebuke him, reprimand him. No, Jesus, this isn't true. Don't say these things. Jesus turns it around on him. Get behind me, Satan. Why? Because you're not thinking of God's plan, God's interests, but man's interests, your own. Whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for the sake of Jesus, for the sake of the gospel, well, he'll save it. He'll achieve that resurrection as Jesus did. But if you want to be my follower, if you want to do that too, you have to deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow me. You too. Jesus doesn't pull a bait and switch. He continues. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world but lose his life? Some versions say soul, because that's what Jesus is talking about, a life that is real, eternal life in him. From the garden to the cross, Jesus was brutally honest about what he'd go through, about his feelings, but brave in brutality. Now, you might say, doesn't the Bible say, don't be anxious about anything? Yeah, but we have to balance those words with others. I've told you before that the Proverbs say, the beginning of all wisdom is fear of the Lord. The Proverbs also say this, Proverbs 14:16, a wise person is cautious, and we'll look at that in a minute, and turns from evil, but a foolish person throws off restraint and is overconfident. Now, we've been using a couple of different versions of the Bible in this season. I'm reading from the CEB. It's a really easy to read translation, and I find it to be fairly accurate. We're also using the NET for our Bible studies. So I want to take you there and point out what they've noted in this word cautious. It says, Hebrews says, fears. Since the holy name, Yahweh, translated Lord, is not used, it probably does not mean here fear of the Lord, but of the consequences of actions. You see, we're supposed to have fear of other things. We're supposed to be intelligently afraid, so to speak. The Greek version of the Old Testament says phobia, fear. We know what that means. Now, here's the thing I want to talk about again. I talked about it in the Corinthians series, and it's worth mentioning again here. Hyperbole. That is to overthrow, to exaggerate, hypervolley, to make a bold statement to get someone's attention, but it's not exactly what you mean literally. Jesus does this a lot. We see that Paul does it a lot. It's a literary device that was used in these letters. Have you ever said something that you don't exactly mean, that you don't intend for someone to take exactly literally? Maybe in quarantine you've said some things like this: if you do that again, I'll kill you. Did you mean that you want to actually murder that person? Maybe you do, but did you mean that you were literally going to kill them? Probably not. At least I hope not. What about, I would never do that? Not in a million years. Do I expect that you're going to believe I think I'm going to live a million years? No. It's an exaggerated point. Jesus taught with hyperbole. So he makes the point, don't be anxious about anything. But he knows that's just the ideal. He knows you're a human, so you're going to get anxious sometimes. It's not the ideal. But we put our hope in him and we try to pray. Let God take it and comfort us. Jesus had agony in the garden. We'll see that he had anxiety. Mark 14:32. Jesus and his disciples came to a place called Gethsemane. Jesus said to them, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him. He began to feel despair and was anxious. He said to them, "I'm very sad. It's as if I'm dying. Stay here and keep alert." Then he went a short distance farther and fell to the ground. He prayed that if possible, he might be spared the time of suffering that he was talking about, the cross. He said, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Take this cup of suffering away from me. However, not what I want, to have to take the suffering away, but what you want." Note, he began to feel despair and was anxious. Was he disobeying himself? No. He was honest about what he was feeling on the inside, but obedient and brave to the cross on the outside. Paul has anxiety. We saw this in 2 Corinthians. In chapter 7, he says that he and Timothy, they're surrounded by all these troubles on the outside and on the inside experiencing fear. Again, the word phobia appears there. In chapter 11, he goes through that long list of all the things that he's suffered for the sake of the gospel, the fool's boast, so to speak. At the end of it, he said, not only all that, but there's the concern, this anxiety that I have for all the churches. Paul was anxious, and he was honest about it. Ultimately, they took it to God in prayer. False bravery leads to a false sense of security and false hope. False sense of security leads to that false hope, leads to falling away. If people think fear is a sign of weak faith, they might give up. Additionally, they might put their hope in something that the full counsel of God's word doesn't promise anywhere. If they are not equipped with the full truth, they'll fall away. They'll fall away because they're not rooted in the truth. You see, Jesus taught in parables. And in one such parable, the parable of the sower, the parable of the soil, some say, he talks about people falling away. They don't understand it at first, but he explains, and I want to focus on the seed that falls on the rocky ground. There's the one that is immediately plucked up. There's the rocky ground. There's the one that falls among thorn bushes. They grow up around the seed and it can't reach its full potential. And then there's the one that falls on fertile soil. These are the ones that grow up and yield a crop 30, 60, 100 times. But here, I want to focus on this for what we're talking about today. Mark 4:16. Here's the meaning of the seed that fell on rocky ground. When people hear the word, they immediately receive it joyfully. Because they have no roots, they last for only a little while. When they experience distress or abuse because of the word, they immediately fall away. When we aren't honest with people, they're going to fall away when things get hard. They'll say, "I didn't sign up for this. You didn't tell me this was going to happen." It's bait and switch. They're going to fall away when things get hard. Christians need to be rooted in the truth. Part of that truth is that we will experience suffering in this world. This is repeated over and over and over again by everyone from Jesus to Peter to Paul. It's the truth. Jesus doesn't give false hope. He says that in this world you will have suffering. But we're to put all our hope in him because he's the only hope that doesn't disappoint. We need to teach like Jesus with balance, not with a bait and switch. Jesus was brutally honest about his feelings, whether it be righteous indignation, that is, righteous anger, sorrow, or anxiety. We need to try to be like Jesus outwardly and be brave when it's our turn to come up to the plate by having a hope in him, a comfort in God. Jesus is the only hope that doesn't disappoint. So let's reflect. How might we be acting inconsistently? Are we walking the walk or just talking the talk? Do our actions meet our words? Do we practice what we preach? I explained in one of my devotionals recently that hypocrisy was one of the reasons that people in the outside world sometimes don't like Christians very much. Are we being hypocrites? They view us as hypocrites because we don't always practice what we preach, if we're being honest. So it's important that we act consistently with what Jesus taught. Maybe the outside world doesn't know all of Jesus' teachings, but they kind of get the point. I think sometimes better than we do. So when we put that Jesus fish on the car, should we be cutting people off? Should we be flipping people off? I don't think so. As we go through this here, do we do this in our own homes? Do we tell our kids, don't say bad words? And they say bad words ourselves? Are we being an example? Are we saying, clean up your mess, and then not clean up our own? I think these things that we should be reflecting on. The other thing that people don't like about Christians, the outside world, that is that they say we're judgmental, constantly pointing fingers at others. So next week, we're going to take a look at that. We're going to see that we should be concentrating on our own sin instead of the sin of others. Until then, I want to leave you with these words from Peter, who was encouraging Christians who were suffering. 1 Peter 5, starting at verse 6. Therefore, humble yourselves under God's power so that he may raise you up in the last day. That's the resurrection we're talking about. Throw all your anxiety, because he knows we have it, onto him, because he cares about you. Be clear-headed. Keep alert. Your accuser, the devil, is on the prowl like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him. Stand firm in the faith. Do not do so in the knowledge that your fellow believers are enduring the same suffering throughout the world. After you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, the one who called you into his eternal glory in Christ Jesus, will himself restore, empower, strengthen, and establish you. To him be power forever and always. Amen.
Did you know we have an app? You can download it and read the Bible, stay up to date with what's going on, read our sermon notes, watch a message, and so much more. You can also give securely. Download the C3 Naples app in your app store.